2026, it's here. We're in it. And will likely be a month before my brain recalibrates to the new year, still in 25 mode and keep saying 2025. But we are now firmly in the new year, which is very exciting. And Small Business by the Numbers, I have with me Peter Hansen with the Research Center, and we're going to talk about what we saw in 2025 related to small businesses and our monthly economic trends survey, and then what we anticipate seeing in the near term in 2026 from our December data that we are releasing today. And I'll start off by talking a little bit about what notable takeaways from 2025 we saw within our data, within kind of the general economic conditions, what was surprising. Peter will go into what we're looking for in the new year in 2026. And then we'll get into some of the numbers related to the December data of the survey results. So I think one of the takeaways from 2025 was the talk related to a possible recession. And there were predictions and focuses on looking at numbers, seeing where the cracks might be, where the economy might fall apart, and it didn't. For the most part, we tripped a little in the first quarter of the year. There were policy changes that impacted business investment, consumer spending, prices, inflation, things like that. But since then, consumer spending, and we keep hearing about AI investment supporting the U.S. economy. Obviously, small business owners are benefiting from the consumer spending strength of that part of spending in our economy. So we didn't see much of anything related to a downturn or even signals in cracks in the system or cracks in the data that we can specifically point to say, yep, we're worried about that. So it was a fairly good year. It was a good year for small business. Generally speaking, obviously there are challenges for pockets of small businesses, but it seemed to be that those pockets were fairly small, pretty shallow. So there wasn't a whole lot to make note of in a negative context outside of just challenges that they have in operating their business. But as far as the possibility of a recession, just didn't see it happen in the economy generally or in the small business sector. And that was really good news to see from our data every month coming in. I'll turn it over to you, Peter, on what your takeaways are or what you're thinking about as far as data, what you're looking for in 2026. And yes, we are in 2026, and I will continue to remind myself that.
Yeah, I mean, reflecting on what you said, anytime you enter a year, odds of a recession, maybe something like 1 in 4 or 1 in 3 if things are pretty normal. Last year, odds were maybe a little bit higher, and especially after that Q1 GDP print was negative, which, as you mentioned, it's a function of some of the way that that's measured and some of the changed investment patterns specifically related to trade with tariffs causing the print to be negative. But if you look at prediction markets, odds went above 50%. There's a lot of uncertainty throughout the year, wondering about which way the arrow would end up pointing. And hey, good news, 2025 worked out mostly overall, most metrics, pretty fine. That's great. Looking forward, if you want to focus on one factor to watch for in 2026, it's hard to pick. I mean, I think the first thing that leapt to mind for me was labor market. We've talked before, and I'll talk a little bit more later about how the labor market in our stats, in public stats, is something where the level's okay, but the trend is a bit concerning. So that's sort of like certainly something to watch for in 2026. But I think the one thing that I'm concerned about to keep my eye on is pricing data. Now, we've seen a lot of concerns related, of course, to trade policy, related, of course, to the course of inflation over the past few years about what was going to happen with inflation and with prices in 2025. What we saw was mostly good news. Now, at the end of 2024, expectations were for inflation to come really pretty close to in line with the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. Throughout 2025, it's been a little worse than maybe that initial expectation, but with the shifting tariff policy, a lot of people are predicting much higher inflation, kind of like a shoe to fall once those percentages on imports hit. Well, looking at the inflation data that we have, looking at our data, it's mostly stayed pretty okay. Now, the concern is that maybe there's a point where businesses are going to pass this along a little more. The prices are going to hit. Obviously, this is another reason why to watch for it in 2026. Affordability is the big political buzzword, and we've got midterm elections coming up, so you're going to be hearing a lot about it. What's our data saying? Well, for the most part, it's decent, although we saw in November a particular increase in the price changes, and that climb kind of leapt really to a level that was not nearly as high as we've seen in the two big inflation eras. That was like 1970s into early 80s, and then, of course, post-COVID inflation. But it was a level that was higher than everything else. We'll talk more about how that's evolved in December. But for me, that's a really big one to watch because of the policy context, because of the observations we've seen in our data, and then with those midterm elections and how much everyone's going to be talking about it. And our data is going to be a really interesting lens through which to see how businesses are faring and what they're thinking about.
And I agree. It's interesting because for small businesses, the affordability issue, and they talk about this a lot, but in different contexts of business operations. So the affordability issue could be related to supplies and inventories, whether they're subject to tariffs or whether it's supply chain disruptions or whether it's something else related to just the building up of costs in that area. Other areas of affordability that is of concern to a lot of small business owners is, say, the cost of health insurance. So they're having to absorb those increases into their pricing. Unfortunately, for many small business owners, the cost of health insurance is unpredictable year to year. And so it's sometimes a shock how much of an increase they're having to deal with and having to restructure those plans to continue to offer them for their employees, but also in covering themselves. For a lot of small business owners, they are also participating in the employer-sponsored health insurance plans. And even if they aren't, even if it's just buying in the individual market, they're having to deal with increased health insurance costs. Or it could be insurance, property insurance, business insurance. We know that in the state of Florida, they're having a lot of issues related to business insurance or property insurance. And then there's auto insurance, and all of those costs are increasing too, being a frustrating component of trying to figure out how to absorb those costs and stay competitive. Until a couple years ago, I just really didn't have a full appreciation of the challenges of repricing your products or services related to inflation and how time-consuming, taxing, anxiety-provoking, all of the parts of it for small business owners, and trying to manage that up against consumer expectations of whether they're going to continue to buy whatever you're selling. And so all of that, very stressful. Wanted to just put kind of that affordability word in context of what that looks like for a small business owners. So let me pivot to just then talking about the December data. And brief summary, the index improved from November, which was a great sign. The components, the main component, the main driver of the increased index was business conditions. So more small business owners are expecting business conditions to improve over the next 6 months. That's certainly a great sign that they're moving into 2026 with increased optimism and an increased expectation that business conditions will improve, making their ability to operate their business easier for them. That's a good sign. Otherwise, the index components and their movement in shifting the index higher, it was pretty quiet. Not much else going on within the index and the 10 components. So it was a pretty quiet report. There were some notable things. Again, that 9 percentage point increase for business conditions improving. And then there were a few other areas that I thought were interesting. One of which also kind of signals this quietness as far as unique challenges facing small business owners is that moving up to the top place in the leaderboard for single most important problems was taxes. So now taxes is at the top of the list. And underneath that, just a point under. So, it's not kind of an outsized gap between the first and second place of challenges here, is labor quality. And Peter will get into that. Taxes and regulations on the best day are problems for small businesses. They are always going to be kind of the challenge that is the most kind of predictable challenge that business owners face, whether it's the complexity of taxes, the level of taxes that they have to pay on business income, on property, on all the taxes that they have to deal with. And then the regulatory environment, depending on where you are in the country or what industry you're in, the regulatory environment can be more or less painful for you in operating the business. But, those two are generally at the very top of the single most important problem list. And then everything else generally falls below that when we're in an environment that's pretty stable, where there aren't kind of outsized challenges. Of course, over the last number of years, there have been a whole host of outsized challenges, especially in the labor market and with inflation. And, every so often, kind of credit creeps up there, but, that's a rare occasion. So it's been a long time since we've seen another issue that is kind of a mainstay top the leaderboard. And so this month, it ended up being taxes. So that was kind of an interesting shift, and also kind of showing that things seem to be moderating out a bit as far as unique challenges, unique environment circumstances that small business owners are having to deal with. So I wanted to, make note of that. And now I'll turn it over to Peter to talk about what he found notable within the December data that we're releasing today.
Yeah, first of all, echoing a nice quiet report, sometimes really welcome to see, especially when the optimism index is above average, ticking up just a little bit. Kind of crazy this month, 10 components, 5 of them were at 0, no change. I don't think I've ever seen that before. Haven't been at this game as long as you have, Holly, but...
well, I haven't seen that in a long time either.
Yeah,
so
certainly a nice, calm December report here. But one thing that kind of stood out to me was the various labor questions. Now, that's been a theme overall that we've talked about in our podcast here. And I think the main message that we've been talking about is that if you look at the labor market data over the last several years and leading into the current time, you see a level that is okay. Maybe it's a touch lower than you would like, but it's in the kind of part of the bell curve that is fine. But when you look at the trend, it's heading downwards. Now, the first part of that downward trend was taking us from a really overheated labor market in the post-pandemic recovery, that 2022 into 2023 era. We really needed the labor market to settle down, ease back on inflation, make it more reasonable to do business, allow people to stay in their jobs, everything be just more comfortable. So that was good for a while.
Ease the nerves of small business employers out there who
Right.
are just really struggling and having it occupy so much of their time.
Absolutely. Things needed to be at equilibrium. They were out of whack before. They became in whack. And I don't think that's something anyone says, but they really reached the kind of appropriate, healthy equilibrium.
Yeah.
But once we kind of entered that appropriate, healthy equilibrium, the labor market continued to slow. Now, that appropriate, healthy equilibrium is a range, so slowing within that is certainly not the end of the world. And the level that we're at right now, I think, still healthy. And we've seen in the last 2 months, and I would say this month more than last month, a bit of, let's say, the start of stabilization. So the plane has been tilted down for a long time. It was too high. It was at an unhealthy altitude. And the question was, will its nose start to flatten out at a healthy level?
Or as one might say with your analogy, a good cruising altitude.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like this is really, I would say, like kind of the first month that suggests to me like maybe it really is hitting that cruising altitude, not continuing to descend, not tilting up either, but it's not giving us that conclusion, but opening the door to that conclusion. So
yeah,
hopefully this December report It's just the first piece of data that we need, but hopefully it is that first step and it's followed up in the coming months as well.
And I would add on to that, too, because it does seem like there is a bit of leveling off here, which is a really good sign because when things are coming off of a high peak, you're concerned about where it's going to level off and not too low. But it seems to be in a fairly comfortable state, although we know that this is very dependent on the industry of the small business owner and how challenging labor is or filling positions. So it's very dependent on what industry they're in. But with this leveling off, we're still seeing pressure for compensation. So we did see a bit of a spike just this last month of an increased number of small business owners saying that they increased compensation this last quarter. So we'll kind of see where that's going. Plans to increase compensation flattened out, so we shouldn't expect to see actual compensation changes go much higher because they're not planning to in any large numbers. So when I was looking at the data, what stood out to me was the kind of self-evaluation health of the business. And that number just hasn't changed over about the last 12 months. It's been within this very narrow band of our members, random sample every month, saying that they assess their business as doing excellent, good, fair, or poor. And the percentages in each of those groups has remained pretty stable, with the majority of them, vast majority of them, being in the good and excellent camp. Good is kind of the outsized number of small business owners that assess their business in that space. But I would have suspected a bit more volatility with that question, and we haven't seen it. And so I'll be looking at that moving forward into 2026 throughout this year, with the higher percent of those saying that they expect business conditions to improve, rounding out the last month of them not shifting too much around their self-assessment of their business, and kind of labor market moderating a bit, but still at healthy levels of open positions, hiring plans, all of that. We're a bit lower than the height of pre-pandemic tight labor market and certainly post-pandemic tight labor market. There doesn't seem to be much immediate concern, at least, going into the new year, which is a good sign. We'll find out next month when we get the January data, our first month in the new year, and see how this tracks as far as small business owner sentiment. But hopefully by then I will have ceased saying 2025 and recalibrated my brain appropriately for the new year. But we'll look forward to that. Any concluding thoughts on either 2025 or 2026?
Well, I did promise to talk about the latest pricing data when I was talking about what
That's
I think is the main thing that I'm looking forward to tracking in 2026. So let me double click on that. First of all, in November, what we had seen was a particularly notable increase in what businesses were doing with their prices, what they reported having done in the last month in a negative way. That spiked to a level that was well below 2022, well below the 70s, but much higher than it was the previous month, and higher actually than any other point outside of those two kind of big inflation
far
eras.
More small business owners were saying that they were going to increase prices that month.
Concerning. What we saw in December was a step back from that, but not back to the level we were at before. So kind of if we took 10 steps forward, we took 2 steps back on observed prices. So
not back to October.
Right. And it's still at a level that's quite unusual in the history of our index. Good news is price plans also took a step back, and they never really left kind of the range that they were in preceding months. So that's just one where in a quiet report is something that is higher than maybe you would have hoped in October, lower than you would have hoped after November, potentially, when November jumped so much. But we'll watch that going forward. But overall, I'd say one more thing to hope for in 2026, more quiet reports like this. Let's just keep sliding up a half point every month on
I think
optimism.
Everybody would appreciate
uncertainty is way down as well. Didn't mention that. 7 points down on uncertainty, lowest since mid-2024.
Absolutely.
Killing the game over there. Let's see more of that.
Yeah, small business owners definitely are, through our data, have reported that they're more confident in the state of the economy. So they're more certain about what to expect. That's always a good sign. So yes, forgot about that uncertainty index. Should have noted that at the beginning of the summary with the improved optimism index and the decline in the uncertainty index. I mean, we always talk about that uncertainty is always a problem for small business owners and not feeling confident about how to operate and invest in their business going forward. But the level of certainty can either be moving in a negative way or a positive way. And this time it was shifting into a positive way. And that was a great trend for this. So again, looking forward to January data that'll come in next month to see where some of this goes, whether it's further confidence with a lower uncertainty index, with further decline in the percent of business owners increasing prices, which will certainly help on the inflation front. So thank you all for joining Small Business by the Numbers, and we'll see you next month.